Hi, my name is Megan Sweet, and welcome to my presentation around keeping community at the heart of the school change. I'm really excited to have you here with me. I'm going to share my screen. So many of us in education have been confronted with the need to create significant change in our schools and our school communities and the way we even approach education in response to the pandemic, as well as in response to the changing needs of our students. Many of our students are learning in different ways. They are interacting with media and their environment in ways that actually mean that we need to change the way we educate our kids. And whenever we want to make any kind of a change, it's really important that we bring that change through and see it through the lens of the different people within our school communities that would be impacted by that change. And that's what we'll be talking about today. So as a part of that presentation, we'll be talking about the elements of servant leadership, which is really just the leadership style and approach. We'll be talking about what that is and why that's so important to be an effective community change agent. Then we'll talk a little bit about empathy, which is one of those elements of being a servant leader, and how that's important for planning a community engagement process. Then we'll discuss some community engagement strategies, ways that you can actually work with your community to lead a change. And then throughout, we're going to be talking about self-care, why self-care is important, and we'll be practicing some self-care with some mini self-care breaks. It's probably no surprise to any of you, anywhere where you are in the world. We are all, as educators, extremely stressed out and tired. So being able to have a chance for some self-care and some relaxation is really, really important. And so we need to make sure that we take the time for that. So let's get going. A little bit about who I am. I'm a career educator. I've been a teacher, a school leader, and a district leader in the United States for 28 years. Most of the time I've spent in California. And my specialty that I did my doctoral degree research in was around education change management with a focus on finance reform. And really what that means is what are the best strategies and tools for leading a change in a community, and how can we actually plan the most effectively and use our money in the best possible way to lead a change. So I'm really excited to be sharing a lot of my both professional expertise and my school learning in our conversation today. So let's start by defining what leadership is. And I'm going to be sharing some definitions of leadership that come from thought leaders primarily in the United States. Some of these names might be recognizable to you, some might not. But really, it's just their definition of leadership, because it's really important for us to have a definition of what a leader is so we can understand their role in leading community change. So the question is, what is a good leader and what is leadership? This comes from Rosalind Carter, the wife of Jimmy Carter, one of our presidents here in the United States. And she says, a leader takes people where they want to go. A great leader takes people where they don't necessarily want to go, but ought to be. And this is from Joanne Ciula. Leadership is not a person or a position. It is a complex moral relationship between people based on trust, obligation, commitment, emotion, and a shared vision of the good. And this is from Warren Bennis. Leadership is the capacity to translate vision into reality. This is from Henry Kissinger, one of our leaders. The task of the leader is to get his people from where they are to where they have not been. This is from Harry Truman, a former president. My definition of a leader is a man who can persuade people to do what they don't want to do or do what they're too lazy to do and like it. Kind of an interesting one. Stephen Covey, who is a leadership expert here in the United States, says that effective leadership is putting first things first. Effective management is discipline, carrying it out. Steve Jobs, one of the founders of Apple Computers, says that innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower. Lao Tzu, who is a Chinese philosopher, says that a leader is best when people barely know he exists. When his work is done, his aim fulfilled, they will say, we did it ourselves. Mark Sanborn says, you don't need a title to be a leader. And now I thought we could spend some time for you, just spending a few minutes jotting down what you think a leadership is and what makes an effective leader. So just take a few moments to jot down your own ideas, and I will wait patiently while you do that. A few moments to note what an effective leader is and what leadership means to you. I just gave you a few examples. Okay, so keep that leadership definition in mind. And as I said, we're going to be talking about something called servant leadership in just a moment. But let's talk a little bit about what leadership is and some of the truths around leadership. And the past quotes gave us some hints about some of that. So leadership is situational. Different situations call for different approaches and kinds of leaders. And leaders can then emerge in different ways. It's influenced by our culture and values. So what we identify as a strong leader and what we believe a good leader looks like is often influenced by our culture and our norms. It's dynamic. It can change over time. So we as leaders can change over time, as well as the kind of leadership that's needed in an organization can change from time to time. It's personal. It's absolutely heavily influenced by our relationship with ourselves. So the more we know ourselves, the better we are connected with our own beliefs and ideals, the more that's going to show through in our leadership. It's male dominated, both in the United States and around the world. So it has long been a situation where women have not had as many leadership opportunities as men. That is starting to slowly change. But the reality is it's been male dominated for most of our history. And for sure, it's true in the United States, and I think certainly true in lots of other parts of the world. It's reflective of and to the benefit of the culture of power. So whichever culture has the most power and dominance wherever you are in the world, often the leadership and the people who end up rising to leadership are a part of that culture of power. They're part of that group that has influence. In the United States and in other countries that experienced imperialism, it is often the case that that is white dominated. So white conquestors who came out and took over other countries. This is the definition of leadership from the person who we're going to be studying a little bit more closely. His name is Robert Greenleaf. He's the one that coined the phrase servant leadership, and this is how he defines it. Leadership is about service to others and a commitment to developing more servants as leaders. It involves co-creation of a commitment to a mission. So that's a little bit of what Robert Greenleaf describes as leadership. So Robert Greenleaf is a retired AT&T executive. He was a leader in an organization here in the United States that's AT&T is responsible for telecommunications. Now it's a cell phone provider. He wrote a book called Servant Leadership in 1977. And the main notion of this book was that, and in his approach to leadership, is that effective leaderships are ones that are in service to their organization and to their staff, which is a really big change in focus and orientation than anything that had been written before then. And that's why this leadership approach is called servant leadership. He got the inspiration for this style of leadership based on the character Leo in Journey to the East, which was written by Hermann Hesse. And very briefly, Leo was kind of like a page or a guide helping this group of men that were from foreigners to travel along in a foreign country. And while the men thought that he was a servant or basically a lower ranking person than them, it actually comes to light that Leo is a leader of his within his country, and the people just didn't see it. And it really was Leo's approach to guiding these men, which was a servant-based approach, that made them confused in that way. And really what Robert Greenleaf said was that he felt like it would bring more joy to all parts of a person's life and definitely make for better business if we were a servant first. So that was his approach to leadership, and that's what we'll be exploring for part of this presentation. And really, servant leadership is a mindset more than anything else. So I will talk about the components of servant leadership, but more than anything else, it's a mindset. And that mindset is service first. So we focus on and try to understand how to be of service to, again, our staff or our organization, more than be self-interested. So that's the shift. And really, even the founder of servant leadership, Robert Greenleaf, didn't have a lot of specificity about what a servant leader should look like, because it is really contextual. But here's that shift in orientation. And I will note that this is one of the first big shifts that we need to pay attention to. And I'm actually going to talk about two different shifts in orientation today. This is shift number one. And that's really going from what this visual is showing us here, a shift from a place where the leader is on top and it's much more militaristic, or the leadership is in charge and the people that are his subordinates must do whatever the leader says. So the leader is the one that's guiding or leading everybody from the top. The shift in orientation is that if you're a servant leader, you're actually the one that's actually promoting the ideas and the success of your staff. So you're the one holding them up and helping them to be successful. So that's the first big shift. So why don't we take another moment for you to do a little bit of journaling and just checking in with yourself. Have you ever been on a team where you felt lifted up and supported by your leader, and how did that feel? And how was that experience perhaps different from a time when you're on a team where the leader was more directive? So just take a few moments to think about that big shift in orientation from being with someone who was directive and top down versus somebody who wanted to support you as a staff member to have your ideas flourish. So just take a few moments to jot some ideas down, and I'll just wait here. Wonderful. So just again, hold that in mind, what those feelings were like. So this is a graphic from a researcher here in the United States called Margaret Wheatley. And she basically had this notion that as leaders, we need to attend to kind of 6 different areas of our leadership. One is information, basically communicating ideas to people. Relationships, how do we attend to the relationships within our organization or our teams, and the identity of ourselves, of our staff members, and of our organization. And those are all things that she said were below the green line. So those were things you didn't always see. They weren't really always obvious. And then above the green line are things like operations, how you actually have the organization function, the structures that support the organization to be effective, and any strategies you use to implement your plan. So this is her notion of leadership. And what Margaret Wheatley basically said, and what's true about servant leadership, is that whatever you do, however you attend to what's below the green line, absolutely affects your effectiveness on things above the green line. So if there are not positive relationships within your organization, or people are feeling unhappy or uncomfortable, or they don't feel seen or supported, that's going to affect the ability for the organization to implement their strategies, to have structures that are effective, or to have any operational effectiveness. So it's really important, therefore, that you attend to the things below the green line. And that's a lot of what servant leadership helps you to do. Here are the 10 qualities of servant leadership. So there's self-awareness, listening, healing, empathy, commitment to employees' growth, as well as conceptualization, persuasion, foresight, stewardship, and building community. So we'll get into what those are in a minute. But before we get any farther down the line, I do want to do this little kind of quick moment to reinforce that if you look at these elements of servant leadership, that's a lot of giving and providing towards others. And there are also some elements in here that are required for us to have within ourselves to be able to be successful. In particular, I'm thinking about all the things that are on the left-hand side: the self-awareness, listening, healing, empathy, and commitment to employees' growth. To be able to have those, it really requires that we have those same commitments towards ourselves. And self-care is a really important way to start to establish that internal relationship so that we can be more giving to our staff. So we talk a lot about self-care. I want to give you a quick definition. Self-care is showing genuine care and concern for yourself, is treating yourself like you would a loved one. So that's self-care. Self-care has two main elements. It's both emotional and physical. And really you could think of it as three elements. It's mental, emotional, and physical. But when you're attending to your self-care and you're doing your thoughts and emotions, you're paying attention to how you're feeling and you're honoring your feelings. You're paying attention to what thoughts you're having and seeing how those thoughts are impacting your sense of self and well-being. And you start to work on that. You start to care for those elements. Self-care is also about treating and taking care of our physical bodies, which is often what people, I think, tend to think about self-care. And they tend to think about it as like, oh, I'm going to go to the gym, or I'm going to have a nice meal, or maybe I'm going to get my fingernails or toenails done or something like that. And while those are elements of self-care, it's really about paying attention to and honoring the experiences in our physical body. So there's those two elements of self-care. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail here. This is a quote from a woman named Audre Lorde, who was a civil rights activist in the United States. And she said, "The caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare." So because she was a civil rights activist, an African-American woman who identified as gay, she was fighting for a lot of rights for herself and for her community. And she really likened self-care to her ability to continue on having the energy and the physical capability of being able to fight for her other rights. So she saw self-care as absolutely an essential part of being able to be effective in her work as a civil rights leader. And I'd say for educators today, this is also really important. Educators around the world are being overwhelmed by what they're facing as they come back to school. Students are often coming back really challenged. There's been a lot of loss of students and leadership and teachers across the world due to COVID-19. And the stress levels in schools, especially in the United States, I can say for sure, but I'm also sure around the world, are extremely high. So our ability to take care of ourselves and attend to both our physical well-being as well as our mental and emotional well-being are absolutely crucial to our ability to stay in teaching. So, and to be effective leaders. So please do take care of yourself. Speaking of which, let's take a quick self-care break. So mindfulness is a really great self-care practice. It's one that I talk about a lot, encourage people to do. But let's take a 3-breath micro practice self-care break. I love this practice because it's something that we can do wherever we are. We can do it with our eyes open or closed. We can do it off alone by ourselves, or we can do it standing in front of a room full of kids or sitting at a meeting. It doesn't really matter. It's 3 breaths. It's fairly quick, but it's really important. So I'm going to guide you in this. I am going to close my eyes because that's most comfortable for me, but you can choose to keep them open. It's up to you, but we're going to take 3 breaths together. So I'm going to close my eyes. If you'd like to close your eyes along with me, please do. Please have your feet flat on the ground and your hands just resting comfortably in your lap. Have your back straight, but not rigid. And your first breath is really just connecting back in with your breath. So taking a deep breath in, holding it, and then letting it go. Second breath in, breathing in. And now feel into your body. Is there anywhere that feels tight or constricted? Perhaps it's your forehead or your neck and shoulders. And with that out breath, try and relax it just a little bit. And with your third breath in, ask yourself what's most important right now. Acknowledge whatever comes up and then release that with your final breath. That's a 3-breath micro practice. Like I said, you can do that with your eyes open or closed. It's just a really nice way for us to connect back in with our bodies again. I feel already instantly more relaxed. And it can help us remember why we're doing whatever we're doing, what's most important in the moment. And that can be really helpful for us. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about those elements of servant leadership. And really what we're going to do throughout the rest of this presentation is explore a few of those elements in more detail than others. I want to make sure you have the full breadth of what servant leadership is and how it applies to community engagement. But I'm also not going to lecture at you the whole time. So let's talk a little bit about a few of these elements. So as I said, there are these 10 qualities of servant leadership. And you can imagine that those on the left-hand side are really qualities that you are around focusing on building a sense of self and other. And on the right-hand side, it's a focus on building consensus and a shared vision. We're going to start with the below the green line items first. And we're going to start right with the top one, which is self-awareness. So this is this is a quote from a well-known educational researcher here in the United States named Diane Cattell. And she says that the self-aware leader is committed to the ongoing process of continual and sustained self-improvement, leading them to create environments in which reflection and inquiry are encouraged, and assumptions about people or issues are examined carefully. Such environments are safe for personal expression and group exploration. So in other words, servant leaders are self-aware leaders. Oops, I'm sorry. Here's why this is important. So self-awareness has two elements to it that are really important for us to pay attention to. One is when we're self-aware, we gain a greater sense of and support for ourselves. And when we do that, it actually, there's proof of it in research, it leads to greater happiness, clarity, and emotional intelligence. So the more we're self-aware, the happier we are. And the more we're able to use our emotional intelligence to understand ourselves and others better. And when we're self-aware as leaders, it also helps us to create safe and supportive work environments and teams. And those are really crucial for our effectiveness to be able to lead changes in our communities. I have founded an organization called Your Three Eyes, based on some ways to help us to see with more depth or to deepen our self-awareness. And I say that there's kind of three lenses that we need to use to be able to develop our self-awareness. The first one is intellect, so our ability to use our logical thinking brain. That's one lens that's really important. Westerners tend to use that very heavily. Other parts of the world, maybe it's less important, but our intellectual, logical thinking and reasoning brains are important. So that's one lens that we can use to develop our self-awareness. The second is what I call insight, which is really perspective taking. So it's understanding ourselves, our cultural backgrounds, the norms in our families and our communities that influence how we see people interact with the world. It's also about perspective taking on our leadership. What have we done as leaders that have been effective in the past? Where are places that we need to grow? If we're contemplating leading a change in our community, insight also helps us to have some reflection on what was successful last time and where do we need to make a change moving forward. And then finally, the third lens is intuition. And intuition really is actually about getting out of our heads and getting back into our hearts again, learning how to listen to our hearts and our guts, but basically listening to information that doesn't necessarily come from our thinking brain, but it's based on a more intuitive sense, our sense of what we think is right and wrong, what our gut tells us might be a good move moving forward. So when you put all three of those together, I call it your three eyes. And it gives us what I call three-dimensional sight, which basically is, if you imagine looking at a 3D picture, it's kind of fuzzy and a little bit out of focus when you look at a 3D picture. But when you put on those 3D glasses, suddenly that same picture gets a depth and perspective that's really different. So you can actually, it kind of jumps out at you. And my experiences and the work that I do is shows that when you use those three lenses or start using three-dimensional sight and apply it to yourself and into your work environment, it helps us to see the areas that we need to change with a lot more clarity. And it also helps us to make much more powerful and informed decisions. So it's really helpful for us as we go through leading school changes and working with our community. Okay, as I said, we have 10 qualities of servant leadership. The focus is on building a sense of self and other, and we've already talked about self-awareness. So let's get to a little bit more of them. So self-awareness, check. The next one is listening. Listening means basically giving our full attention and listening to understand new perspectives and ideas. When we're listening leaders, we ask good questions and we focus more on the conversation than getting specific answers. So we're comfortable with being a little bit more open-ended. Another element is healing. So a part of our work as servant leaders and as community leaders within our school communities and within our larger communities is attending to the healing that's needed, both for past harms we might have done as a leader ourselves, or the pain or the challenges that are within our community. So in the United States, for example, there's a lot of healing we still need to do around our history of slavery in the United States and the biased laws and policies we've had since then. So you want to attend to both the larger cultural ones within our society, also within our local community. It requires empathy, which really is our ability to understand different perspectives and experiences and support people to think together. So moving away from that top down, only one way to go, but actually, how can we understand different forms of knowledge and how that might be influential for us? And finally, the last one is a commitment to our employees' growth. If you remember that image of what a servant leader is, kind of holding up their employees, servant leaders work to make sure that employees' best attributes and skills come forward and that they're supported to grow. So here's a little bit more about empathy and leadership, just so we can have that together. So there's a research and a growing body of research that suggests that empathy is the most important leadership skill to address the multiple levels of stress we are experiencing today. So being an empathetic leader is crucial for us in this time in the world. And the research has shown that empathy contributes to positive relationships and organizational cultures that drive results, including innovation, engagement, retention, sense of inclusivity, and ability to have a positive work-life balance. So being an empathetic leader is really crucial today. Okay, that was a lot of information. So let's take a quick self-care break. This is an opportunity to check in with your body. So again, this is something you can do at almost any time during the day, whatever you're doing. It could be choosing to just take a quick stretch. So you can stretch if you want to. Feeling into your body. It could be feeling into maybe where you're feeling some tightness. So I often feel, especially if I'm stressed, I'll feel tightness in my chest. Or it could be maybe your stomach hurts because you're feeling stressed or overwhelmed. It could be choosing to take yourself outside and just breathe some fresh air or sit under a tree for a moment. So doing anything that's going to help make your body feel better. So take a few more seconds to take care of your body. Great. So these are the other 10 qualities, the other 5 of the 10 qualities of servant leadership. And again, as a reminder, this is focused on building consensus and a shared vision. So I've been talking a lot about servant leadership and why being a self-aware leader is important. Now we're going to kind of shift our focus towards how do you then do the community engagement? So all that stuff above the green line. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to engage our community. Here are those elements of servant leadership, the other ones. So conceptualization. So servant leaders know how to look at the big picture and the long-term outcomes and keep everybody focused and moving in that direction. They're able to persuade groups to create some shared ownership and have some direction in the decisions that they're going. So you're able to work with others. So persuade versus manipulate or force, but really helping people to see a common vision. Servant leaders have foresight. So again, you use that insight that we talked about of one of those 3 I's to evaluate the past experiences and look for patterns. Servant leaders are stewards. We take ultimate responsibility for what happens and attend to any times where people are feeling hurt or harmed, and really are the ones that are the captains of the ship. And we build community. So we help people feel like they're a part of something bigger than themselves, and support positive interactions amongst the people on the team. So why are all these things important? And why community engagement, but why servant leadership, and why attending to all these what might feel like unimportant things, all that below the green line stuff that often gets skipped, especially when there's urgent issues. Well, there's some research that supports why being a servant leader and why attending to the emotional well-being of your staff is so important. On the right-hand side is a study that Google did about the most effective employees and the most effective teams within their organization. And they found that the best employees, the ones that were most successful within Google, were all good communicators. They had empathy towards others and they were good coaches. So they knew how to So they were basically being servant leaders. They knew how to support others and to help to raise other people up and to help create a place where people felt seen and belonged. The best teams within Google promote emotional safety. So they make sure that people feel safe and included. A little bit of that above the green line, but again, a lot of that below the green line work around recognizing identity and supporting people to feel like they're a part of a team. And on those teams, those team members exhibited emotional intelligence and generosity towards others. There's also been some research into servant leadership itself and how effective it is. And servant leadership is linked to employee engagement, people feeling like they're thriving at work, perceptions that their work is meaningful, people having a sense of well-being or safety at their organization, and again, having a positive work-life balance. And there are reductions in things like emotional exhaustion or depletion. So people feeling like their sense of themselves or their ability to continue the work was diminishing, of employee turnover, and also of cynicism, which basically means like having a bad attitude or negative attitude about their work. So all good things and all very helpful and foundational if you're going to lead a change within your community and engage with your community. Here's some specific benefits of servant leadership and of this kind of empathetic leadership in a school-based setting. This goes back to work that I've been doing. It's detailed in my book, An Educator's Guide for Using Your 3 Eyes, those 3 eyes that we've talked about. But basically, if we're going to be a strong servant leader, we start by working with ourselves first and knowing ourselves first. I call this self-work, which basically means that we take care of ourselves, we show ourselves that self-care, and we are committed to developing our emotional intelligence, our self-awareness. When we do that self-work, we have a greater sense of ourselves and a feeling of self-compassion. We like ourselves more and we know ourselves better. And that allows us to enter into and be a part of the difficult conversations and work that are necessary for leading changes within our school communities. So it readies us for that schoolwork. And that schoolwork begins, we've talked about this a lot already, with building a culture of trust and accountability within our teams and our organizations. And then that culture of trust and accountability allows us to collaborate together and work and introduce innovative ideas that are going to transform our school communities. So really important that those two go together. This is another way of looking at that balance between self-work and schoolwork. A fairly well-known symbol to all of us around the world. This is a Chinese symbol, the Yin Yang Symbol, which basically shows that when we work on ourselves, that's the yin side. So we're attending to ourselves, we're readying ourselves, we're caring for ourselves. When we care for ourselves and support ourselves, it readies us to act on the world and make changes in the world, which is the yang side. So yin side is the self-care, self-work side, which readies us for the yang work. And as we do that work on the world, or we lead changes or engage with our communities, it's going to give us more information about ourselves, give us some things to work on, which leads us back into the yin side again. So it's kind of a never-ending cycle of working on and attending ourselves and developing our emotional intelligence, and then using those skills to create changes in the world. Those changes are going to lead to deepened sense of self, and on we go. Okay, another self-care break. This is taking time for reflection. I am from the United States, and there used to be a funny skit on a show called Saturday Night Live where they would have what are called deep thoughts. So I've created a deck of these deep thoughts. Basically, they're reflection cards that you can use to help you think through how you're feeling. It's just a chance to kind of do a spot check. So again, we said that self-care is attending to our thoughts and our feelings. So this is an opportunity for us to pay attention to how our thoughts are showing up in the world. So take a moment and read this deep thought and consider it. So the deep thought is, occupying our minds with past and future events causes us to lose the gift of the present moment. So if we're always thinking about what happened in the past or in the present, we lose the gift of what's happening right now. So the question or the deep thought for you to consider is, how often are you time traveling? How often are you thinking about the past or the future and not living in the present moment? So you can read one of those prompts and write on those, or just journal down anything you want to about how your thoughts and emotions impact you, what thoughts you have on a regular basis. So I'll pause for a moment for you to take this self-care break. And you can go ahead and pause the presentation if you want to take more time. But again, it's really important for us to have those moments for reflection. Okay, so we've talked a lot about emotional intelligence, self-awareness, self-care, why that's all really important, why being a servant leadership, why being a servant leader is so important for our ability to create changes in our school settings. Now let's get a little into how you actually engage with community. It's really important, especially as we're considering leading a change, to know that when we're being servant leaders and we're starting to engage with community, it doesn't mean that we give over to the communities. When we shift from being a top-down leader where we're telling everyone what to do and people are following our guidance without questioning it, and to that place where we're raising people up, it doesn't mean that we actually aren't leaders anymore. It doesn't mean that we're not actually setting the direction. So it's not passive. When you're a servant leader, you're not kind of giving up the reins of your organization to others. It's not democratic. So you're not leading by vote. You're not leading by having people add their ideas in and you just do what vote makes the best decision. Sometimes that's helpful for parts of a big change that you're doing or you're engaging with community. But as we know, as community members, everyone has different perspectives and we don't want to give over that control all the time. It's not directionless. So it's not without having a destination to go. In fact, servant leaders have a very clear direction they're taking everyone, and their focus is on bringing everyone along. Again, not leaderless. Servant leaders are very impactful and important to the effectiveness of any kind of change that we're leading. It's certainly not quick. When you're being a servant leader and you're moving away from something that's top down and directive to one where you're actually building consensus and listening and trying to understand everyone that you're working with, that takes time. So you have to build that foundation, that trust, all those things below the green line before you're really able to mobilize people to move more quickly. Once you've built those relationships and people feel like they're seen, heard, and supported, you can move fairly quickly, but you can't necessarily do that very right out of the gate. You need to take some time to build those relationships first. And it certainly isn't always easy. As a leader myself who practices servant leadership, there are times when I want to go faster or I don't actually want to take the time to talk with everybody. I feel some urgency. Also, it's hard sometimes when we have a strong idea and we've been leaders and we've been effective leaders for a long time. It's hard sometimes to have our idea or our pet project or what we think will be most effective end up not being what carries the day. But when we're being a servant leader, it means that we do have to step aside sometimes and give other people the opportunity to have their ideas lead. And that can just be difficult. So we have to keep working with ourselves. So let's take that work and start engaging with our community so that we know all of that. So here's a quick definition of community. It's a feeling of fellowship with others as a result of sharing common attitudes, interests, and goals. As educators, our communities are many things, right? So it's our specific school community if we're working within a school. It's our regional or district community. It could be our community of people within a religious organization that we're with, if our school is affiliated with that. So community can mean lots of different things, and it can also be nested. So there can be multiple levels of community within one organization. Community absolutely, though, lies at the heart of our schools. So our schools have a great deal of influence on the people they serve and the communities in which they exist. Our schools are a part of a larger community and often are the centers or the hubs of our communities. And our communities have a direct impact on what happens in our school. So they're not separate from one another. Whatever happens in our larger community, whatever our students and staff experience and families experience within our larger community, find their way into our school. So we need each other and we influence each other. And that's really important to remember. So why engage with community? Why take the time to be a servant leader and talk with a lot of different people? Why take that time? It's a lot to do. The first thing is that it brings a lot of enthusiasm for your plan. So if you're engaging with your community, you probably have something that you want to do, whether it's just lead your school effectively or you want to make a change within your school community. you need allies and people within the community that support it and are going to help you to lead it. So you want people that support your school or support your school district and want it to be better and will help to put the time, energy, money, whatever it is, into helping it be true. Another very practical reason is that without buy-in, it's very likely that that same community will start to work against you. So especially if you want to lead a change, it's crucial that the community is actively involved. It doesn't mean that everyone in the community is going to like what you do, but it is important that you engage with them and let them know that their voice has been heard and that you've given them opportunities to be able to share what they think is most important. Because really, if you don't, those same community members, even if they've been passive in the past, will become very active in working against what you're doing. So you really want everybody on your side. Another really important thing is that the various stakeholders that you work with, and we'll talk about those stakeholders in a minute, often hold really vital pieces of information that are important for you as you lead your change initiative. So we don't want to discount that. I once actually took my son with me on a school visit that I was doing, and he was about 7 at the time. And I was really just trying to entertain him as I was walking around doing a school visit. So I asked him to tell me what are the places where he felt like we needed to make some physical improvements to the school. So things like painting or other things like that, because I had to walk around the school campus and I figured that would give him something to do. But my son took it really seriously, and he came back to me with all these ideas that I hadn't paid attention to. So when we were on the yard, he noticed that the basketball hoops were missing a lot of the strings that are attached to the basketball hoops. And that really bothered him. He also noticed places where there were like little characters of kids where the paint had chipped off. And that really bothered him too. And wherever we went, he noticed all these things that could really improve, that to him would make the school feel a lot better and much more welcoming. And to me as an adult, were so unimportant that I barely even noticed them. They definitely didn't make it to the list of improvements that I was paying attention to. But they did once I talked to my son. So every stakeholder, no matter the age, no matter their background, no matter their educational ability, have important ideas to contribute to making the school or whatever change you're imagining better and more effective. And it's really important to listen to those voices and to adjust accordingly. Because once I put myself into the student's perspective, suddenly I saw that campus from a very different lens than before. And again, we want to make sure that any change that we're imagining actually reflects the values and the priorities of that community. So I think a mistake that a lot of leaders make is that they come into a new place and they have their own values and ideas about what's going to make a school better or the community stronger. And they don't actually take the time to understand the community that they're serving. And therefore their ideas are a mismatch for what the needs and the values are of that community. And even if they're effective in implementing that change, they're really unlikely to stick because they're not reflective of the values within that community. So that leads us to the second shift. So I said the first shift was from top-down leadership to one where it's more supporting our staff to be effective. The second, which is also aligned to that same idea, is the idea that there's only one form of expertise and that expert then tells everybody else what to do. So that second shift is from a hierarchical idea of knowledge and expertise to one where actually it's communal, and recognizing that all the different people in our community are knowers and have knowledge in some way. And what's really most important for us as leaders, and especially for leading a community change, is to connect with all those knowers and connect them with one another so that we get as much information as possible, helping us to make the most effective change within our community. So second shift is from hierarchical form of knowledge to communal knowledge. The first way to start gathering that communal knowledge is by asking questions. So we need to determine what change we think we want to make to our school. Again, it could be we're not changing much except for to increase maybe parent engagement, or maybe we're imagining changing the school completely. The level of change really is a little bit neutral. It doesn't really matter. It's more of the process of leading the change that we're going to be talking about here. So determine the change you want to make and start forming some questions you have about it without having any attachment to the answers. So again, if we're servant leaders, we want to ask a lot of questions. We want to listen well, but we also want to be open-minded and see what's coming up. So we don't want to necessarily be attached to having those answers. To generate those questions, you might want to start using the 3 I's. That's a helpful set of lenses through which to start imagining what your questions might be. So for example, if you're using your intellect side of your brain or part of your lenses, you might want to think about, what do you want to know? So if you want to have more parent engagement, for example, in your school community, you want to know what kind of what current parent engagement exists, or maybe what is the research on parent engagement that makes it the most effective, or what are the current parents that are engaging noticing, and what parents aren't engaging right now. You might want to then use your insight to ask another set of questions, such as, how has the past year impacted parent engagement? What parents have historically not been included or had their voices be present in our schools in the past that we might want to focus on specifically? What parent voices have maybe been too loud or too influential that we want to maintain, but we want to balance out with others? So that could be insight. And intuition could be, what does my gut say? Like, when I think about parent engagement, where do I think I'm at? What kinds of interventions does it feel right for us to do? So maybe going from what would be like a logical parent engagement strategy, like sending out another newsletter, but maybe my gut says, actually, we all just need to sit down together and have a meal together, and that will help to increase community engagement and parent engagement that way. So using those different lenses to help you have a sense of some of the questions you might want to explore. Then you want to start to think about who those knowers are. So what are some knowers that you want to engage with those questions? You have a series of questions about parent engagement. Who do you start to talk to about getting those answers? And it can be helpful to think about or categorize the knowers under some of these categories. These aren't exhaustive. There are other forms of knowing out there, but these are 4 categories that are often showing up in schools and in other organizations that might help you. So you might want to think through the knowers that are political, the people that can leverage power and form relationships. Cultural, what's the culture of the school? Who are the people that hold the culture of the school? Things like student discipline and staff wellness. Who are the knowers that have a focus on the programmatic elements of your school, for perhaps like teaching and learning? And who are the knowers that are attending to the organizational management, the administration, the budgeting, scheduling, things like that? Here's some examples of those people that you might want to engage related to those 4 areas of knowing or knowers there. So our political knowers tend to be parents and teachers. In the United States, we have strong unions, so it could be union negotiations, partnerships, board members, people with power, and community partners. Cultural knowers could be the people that attend to student wellness and needs, that do student discipline, who hold the values and norms of the organization. Those teacher and family and student interactions, so places where that takes place, activities and morale. Programmatic could be instructional team, people that handle the curriculum in your school or your community, people that monitor or attend to student achievement, students themselves and how they're achieving, professional development, teacher evaluation, external partners. And again, organizational management could be things like the people that handle the allocation of resources, so the people that are handling your budget. Maybe it's your office staff, people that coordinate across the team. The human resources department who attend to personnel, as well as the operational things like people that manage the schedules and plans. Each one of them is going to look at your school or your school community or your organization in a different way. So you might want to identify 1 or 2 people or more from each of these categories and start asking your questions of those knowers. Here are some considerations as you start to go out there. The first is that listening goes a long way. So as we've talked about before, servant leaders listen well. And you don't want to listen for a specific answer, but you want to listen with the answer that your knowers want to give you. So when you listen to understand versus listen to affirm, the kind of interaction you have with people is different, and the kind of information you can take in is different. So you want to listen to understand rather than to validate or affirm your point of view. Trust is essential. Your knowers, your community members aren't going to share who they are or what's most important to them or their vulnerabilities, so they don't feel like that information is going to be held in a respectful way, or that they're safe to really express their ideas. So you want to create that emotional safety so people trust you and can share their ideas with you. Transparency is really important, both about the issues and the areas of success or gains. It's really important to be as honest as possible. I am not encouraging anyone to share information that is confidential or would not be appropriate to share with different groups of people. But you can say that. And I've done that quite a bit. I've had to do things like close schools and lead other significant changes. And there are times that there are questions or asks for information that I simply cannot share because it wouldn't be appropriate. And that's what I say. But I'm also very honest about the areas that we need to grow. I share my thinking. I share what's going on for me, or as I look at this problem, what seems most evident, and give people an opportunity to engage and give their ideas back. So that transparency is really important. You want to have engagements that draw on knower expertise. So you want to be really thoughtful about how you engage with people and creating spaces where people feel safe to share their ideas, or having engagements in places where the knower's expertise is going to be featured. So don't have all of your engagements always within your school community, but maybe you go to a community center or a church or the office or the place of business where one of these knowers exists. Engaging in a teacher's classroom rather than having people come to the office. So being aware of those positions of power, both for yourself or the people you're engaging with, and finding ways to have multiple engagements where people are going to feel more comfortable, or where they kind of instinctively feel like their knowledge is going to be more respected. When you're engaging with your community, especially if it's going to be leading a big, long time, a big project, is to have a timeline that's transparently shared with everyone, and where they're where they're predictable and consistent. That's where persistent came from. Predictable and consistent opportunities for engagement that build towards your long-term goal. So as I said, servant leaders hold that long-term vision of success. And when you have your engagements with your community, you're slowly moving towards that success or that goal that you're working towards, with a predictable cadence where people know, oh, every month or so I'm going to engage on this, or every 2 months this opportunity is going to come up, and they can also start to see where you're progressing towards your goal. And you need to have proactive and regular communication. So it's an important part of that transparency, but you want to follow up with people. You want to give people a sense of, if you're going to have a meeting, preview what the meeting is going to be about, and then follow up that meeting with vital information. And again, providing more information is almost better than less. I think sometimes folks think that if they don't provide, they're being helpful by editing the kind of information they give out. And certainly you don't want to overwhelm people with too much information, but make sure that you're actually giving as much information as possible so that people know what they're doing, and know where to go. So it just really helps quite a bit to be proactive with that. When you're not proactive with your communication, when you're not proactive with sharing information, what happens is, unfortunately, the reverse, which is people assume that you're hiding something, or that there's information that they need to seek out or get from you. And that can often create some of that resistance or people fighting against you. So that's the end of the presentation. I hope that you learned something about both servant leadership and why that's an important part of being an effective change leader in your community. I hope you also gain some insights on how to work with your community in a more effective way. I have a lot more information and resources on my website, so I invite you to go to my website, which is drmegansweet.com. I also have on there links to some courses related to what we talked about today. So how do you develop that self-work, that emotional intelligence? I have a course on that called Self-Work. And I also have one on leading effective change in schools called Schoolwork. And those are online courses that you can take at any time, wherever you are. There are also blogs and links to podcasts and other support for school change that are on my website. So I invite you to go there. I do have a podcast that I'd welcome you to subscribe to called The Awakening Educator. Myself and another educator interview people around the world talking about their approach to education and education change. And I also wrote a book, which happens to be behind my back here, An Educator's Guide for Using Your Three Eyes, which talks a lot about the same thing. So how do we develop our intellect, insight, intuition, that 3D vision that I was talking about, and how to apply that to our personal lives as well as to our professional experiences. So thank you everyone for coming and being a part of this presentation. I wanted to put up the research that I looked at really briefly, so you can pause your screen if you want to look at any of that research in a little bit more detail. It's here for you. And other than that, thank you very much.